For generations, the British monarchy operated under a guiding principle so simple it almost felt unbreakable. Say nothing, explain nothing. It wasn't just a rule, it was a survival strategy. By staying silent, the royal family positioned itself above the chaos of gossip, scandal, and public scrutiny. While headlines came and went, the institution endured. That approach worked for decades, until it didn't. Everything began to shift when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped away from their roles as senior royals. But their departure wasn't just a quiet exit from palace life. It marked the beginning of something entirely different. Instead of fading into the background, they stepped directly into the spotlight, but this time on their own terms. What followed wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, strategic, carefully constructed. They didn't just leave the monarchy, they built a powerful modern media identity, a brand, a narrative machine designed to shape how the world saw them, heard them, and ultimately understood their story. It was polished, controlled, and highly effective. For years, that system worked flawlessly. Criticism came, as it always does. Former associates spoke out. Tabloids published speculation. Commentators analyzed every move. But through it all, one thing remained consistent: silence. No reactions. No rebuttals. Just a calm, curated distance from the noise. It created an illusion of control. By refusing to engage, they allowed controversies to fade on their own. It was a long-game strategy, one based on the belief that attention dies without oxygen. And for a while it did, but then something changed. The silence didn't just weaken, it disappeared entirely. In its place came something far more aggressive. Statements were issued. Legal warnings surfaced. Public responses became sharper, more direct, and impossible to ignore. The shift was sudden, and it raised a critical question. Why now? Because when you examine the pattern closely, something unusual begins to emerge. It's not just about what they are responding to, it's about what they are choosing not to respond to. Certain claims are met with immediate pushback. Others are ignored completely. And that selective silence, it's becoming impossible to overlook. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the moment when the narrative first faced a serious challenge. For years, there had been speculation, rumors, questions circulating quietly beneath the surface, but most of it remained fragmented, unproven, scattered, and easy to dismiss. Then came a different kind of threat. Not from tabloids, not from online gossip, but from someone known for digging deeper than most. An investigative author with a reputation for taking on powerful figures and not backing down. When his work was released, it didn't rely on vague claims or anonymous whispers. It presented a structured narrative, one that painted a very different picture of how influence, access, and opportunity may have intersected over time. At first, the response followed the usual strategy: silence. No public statements, no attempts to counter the claims. It seemed like the same playbook was being used again. But then, as more details began to surface, the reaction changed. Dramatically. Instead of ignoring the discussion, a forceful statement was issued, one that didn't just dismiss the claims, but attacked them outright. The language was intense, emotional, far removed from the measured tone typically associated with royal communications. It didn't sound like distance. It sounded like pressure. The focus of the response, however, revealed something even more important. Rather than addressing the specifics, it targeted the overall narrative, the tone, the intention, the credibility of the author. But key details? They remained untouched, and that absence didn't go unnoticed. Because in situations like this, what isn't said can matter just as much as what is. The deeper people looked, the clearer the pattern became. Certain topics triggered strong reactions. Others, despite being repeatedly raised, were met with complete silence. That silence began to speak louder than any statement. It suggested boundaries, lines that wouldn't be crossed, questions that wouldn't be answered. And once people started noticing that pattern, everything changed. The story was no longer just about public perception. It became about control, who had it, who lost it, and what happens when it begins to slip. Because once a narrative starts to fracture, it rarely breaks all at once. It cracks slowly, piece by piece. And by the time those cracks become visible to everyone, the foundation has already begun to shift. To understand the present, you have to examine the past, not the public version, but the one that existed behind closed doors. Long before royal titles and global attention, there was a different world taking shape. A quieter one, less visible, but far more influential. Between 2011 and 2016, a period often overlooked in mainstream narratives, something significant was happening beneath the surface. It wasn't dramatic or headline-worthy at the time, but in hindsight, it may have been one of the most important phases in the entire story. This was a time of transition. An actress working within the television industry was beginning to move beyond the limitations of that space. Talent alone wasn't enough to make that leap. It required access, connections, entry into circles that most people never even see. And access like that doesn't happen randomly. It requires a gatekeeper, someone who understands how elite social ecosystems operate, someone who knows who belongs in which room and when. That role, according to multiple reports over the years, was filled by an individual deeply embedded within one of the most exclusive hospitality networks in the world. At first glance, it looked like a private members club, but in reality, it functioned as something much more complex. A controlled environment where influence, business, media, and power intersected, away from cameras, headlines, and public scrutiny. Within those spaces, introductions are made, opportunities are created, relationships form that can reshape entire careers. It's not about visibility, it's about proximity. And during this period, proximity was everything. Travel patterns began to shift. Appearances expanded beyond the expected. Invitations opened doors that didn't align with a typical television career trajectory. To outside observers, it didn't always make sense. But that's because the real activity wasn't happening in public. It was happening behind carefully managed environments where privacy was the most valuable currency. These weren't just social gatherings. They were strategic ecosystems, places where individuals from entertainment, finance, and global business could interact without exposure, where reputations could be built or reshaped without documentation. And at the center of it all were the people who controlled access. They didn't seek attention, they didn't appear in headlines, but they understood exactly how influence worked. During these years, relationships formed that would later become highly significant. Not necessarily in obvious ways, but in how they connected different worlds together. Because elite networks don't operate in isolation. They overlap. The same names appear in different contexts, different industries, different events, and when you start mapping those connections, patterns begin to emerge. It's not about proving anything dramatic, it's about understanding how proximity works at that level, because in those environments, being one step removed can still place you within the same sphere. And that's where things become complicated. Not because of direct involvement, but because of association. Because when multiple individuals move within the same tightly connected network, their paths inevitably intersect. And those intersections leave traces, sometimes subtle, sometimes overlooked, but never completely invisible. Years later, as investigative efforts increased and more attention was placed on historical connections within elite circles, those traces began to resurface. Not as definitive answers, but as pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that challenged the simplicity of the public narrative, because the official version of events suggested a chance meeting, a straightforward timeline, a clean beginning. But the deeper you look, the more that simplicity starts to fade. In its place, a far more complex picture begins to take shape, one defined by access, positioning, and long-established connections. And once that perspective enters the conversation, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because it shifts the question entirely. It's no longer about what happened, it's about how it happened. Behind every exclusive network, there's always a deeper layer, one that isn't immediately visible, but quietly sustains everything above it. Social circles, no matter how glamorous or influential they appear, don't operate in isolation. They require funding, infrastructure, and powerful individuals who ensure the system continues to function. During the years when these elite connections were forming, that financial backbone came from some of the most influential figures in global business. These were not ordinary investors. They were individuals whose reach extended across industries, finance, media, politics, and entertainment. Their involvement didn't always attract attention, but their presence was essential. Because environments built on privacy, exclusivity, and global access don't maintain themselves. They are supported by people who understand the value of discretion and the power of controlled spaces. In these circles, influence doesn't announce itself loudly. It operates quietly, and that's what makes it so difficult to fully understand. When certain names began appearing repeatedly in connection with these networks, it sparked curiosity among journalists and researchers. Not because of direct accusations, but because of how often those names surface across different contexts. It created a pattern that suggested overlapping worlds rather than separate ones. To be clear, proximity alone does not imply wrongdoing. That distinction is important, but in investigative work, patterns matter. Repetition matters. And when individuals move within the same high-level ecosystems, their connections, direct or indirect, become part of a larger narrative. This is where the story becomes more complex, because the same environments that offer opportunity also carry risk. Not necessarily visible risk, but reputational risk, the kind that emerges years later when past associations are re-examined under a different lens. For those navigating these spaces, the balance is delicate. Access can open doors that would otherwise remain closed, but it also creates a network of associations that cannot easily be separated or erased. And over time, those associations begin to form a web that may not be obvious in the moment, but becomes increasingly visible as more pieces of information come together. This is what keeps investigative journalists focused. Not isolated events, but interconnected systems. Because when multiple individuals operate within the same tightly controlled environments, their stories inevitably overlap. And once those overlaps are identified, the narrative begins to shift. It moves away from coincidence and toward structure, away from randomness and toward strategy. What emerges is not a single storyline, but a layered one, built on access, relationships, and positioning within a world that few people truly understand. And that layered narrative is far more difficult to control, because it doesn't rely on a one claim or one event. It's built on patterns, and patterns are much harder to dismiss. Sometimes a single image can reshape an entire conversation. Not because of what it proves, but because of what people believe it might reveal. In early 2026, one such image resurfaced and spread rapidly across the internet. It showed a group of individuals on a luxury yacht, captured during a summer trip years earlier. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, just another snapshot of a high-end social gathering, but timing changes everything. The photograph dated back to a period just before a major turning point in a well-known public relationship. That detail alone was enough to ignite speculation. Within hours, the image was everywhere. Social media users began analyzing every detail: faces, surroundings, context. Lines were drawn, identities were suggested, entire narratives were constructed in real time. It was a familiar pattern. A fragment of reality mixed with assumption, amplified by speed and visibility. At the center of the speculation was a claim that quickly gained traction. One individual in the image was misidentified as someone connected to a widely known controversy. The claim spread fast, too fast, but as quickly as it rose, it began to fall apart. Closer examination revealed that the identification was incorrect. The individual in question was someone else entirely, a reminder of how easily misinformation can take hold when urgency replaces accuracy. In many cases, that would have ended the story. Debunk the claim, correct the record, move on. But this situation was different. Because while the central accusation was false, the image itself was not. The photo was real, the setting was real, the timing was accurate, and the people present were verifiably connected to influential social circles. That distinction mattered, because once the anality to process that had once held the potential for deeper examination. And with that, a unique moment in the timeline came to an end. But its impact remained. Because even without a courtroom resolution, the mere proximity of the narrative to legal scrutiny changed how it was perceived. It demonstrated that the questions being asked were not confined to online discussions. They had reached a level where they were considered within formal legal strategy. That distinction matters. It elevates the conversation. It shifts it from rumor to relevance. And once that shift happens, it cannot be easily reversed. The legal chapter may have closed quietly, but it left behind something far more enduring, a recognition that the story had come closer than ever to being examined under oath. And that possibility, brief as it was, continues to shape how everything else is understood. In the world of public figures, communication is never random. Every statement, every response, every silence, it all carries meaning, especially silence. For years, the approach had been consistent. Avoid unnecessary engagement. Rise above criticism. Let time dissolve controversy. It was a strategy rooted in control. Control of narrative, control of timing, control of exposure. But strategies evolve. And sometimes what isn't said becomes more important than what is. As the narrative continued to develop, a noticeable pattern began to emerge. Certain claims triggered immediate reactions, strong, direct, and often forceful. Others, however, received no response at all, not even acknowledgement. At first, this difference seemed incidental. Not every statement requires a reply. Not every claim deserves attention. But over time, the pattern became too consistent to ignore, because the distinction wasn't random, it was selective. Issues related to privacy, personal correspondence, or media intrusion were addressed quickly and decisively, often through legal channels. These responses were clear, structured, and firmly positioned. But when it came to broader questions about past associations, social environments, or historical connections, the response was markedly different. Silence. No clarification, no denial, no engagement. And in the realm of high-level public relations, that kind of silence is rarely accidental. It's strategic. There's a concept often discussed in communication strategy, a response that appears to address an issue without actually confronting its core. It allows for strong language and visible reaction while leaving key questions untouched. This approach can be effective in redirecting attention, but it also creates gaps, and those gaps tend to attract scrutiny. Because audiences today are more observant than ever, they notice patterns, they compare responses, they ask why certain topics are addressed while others are avoided. And when those differences become visible, they begin to form their own conclusions. This is where the dynamic shifts. Because once the public starts analyzing not just the content of communication, but the structure behind it, the narrative becomes harder to manage. It's no longer about individual statements, it's about consistency, about alignment between words and actions, about what is emphasized and what is left out. In this case, the selective nature of responses has become part of the story itself. Each strong denial invites a closer look at what wasn't denied. Each legal challenge highlights the areas where legal action wasn't pursued. And each silence raises new questions, not necessarily about facts, but about strategy. Because in high-profile situations, choosing not to respond can be just as deliberate as choosing to speak. Sometimes it's a way to avoid amplifying a claim. Other times, it's a way to maintain flexibility. But regardless of the intention, the effect is the same. It leaves space. Space for interpretation, space for analysis, space for narratives to develop independently. And once that space exists, it becomes increasingly difficult to contain. This is further amplified by a phenomenon often discussed in media dynamics, the idea that attempts to control or suppress information can sometimes have the opposite effect. When attention is drawn to a particular issue through strong reactions, it can lead more people to investigate it, to question it, to explore it further. In trying to limit the spread of certain narratives, those narratives can inadvertently gain more visibility. And when that happens, the balance of control begins to shift, because the narrative is no longer being shaped from a single source. It's being influenced by a wider network, journalists, analysts, independent researchers, and an increasingly engaged public. This decentralized attention changes everything. It reduces the effectiveness of traditional communication strategies, it makes selective silence more noticeable, and it turns gaps in the narrative into focal points of discussion. What was once a controlled story becomes a shared investigation. And in that environment, every decision whether to speak or remain silent carries amplified significance. The strategy that once provided stability now faces a new challenge. An audience that isn't just listening, but actively analyzing.